Sekulic, and I'm the Canola Council agronomist for Northern Alberta and British Columbia. And Mike alluded to it, but in addition to functioning as agronomist for Northern Alberta, I'm also the founder of the High Arctic Single Malt Whiskey Appreciators Society and chairman of the League of Extraordinary Beer Gentlemen. So my topic here today is buzzwords about bees. And I think one thing the last presenter neglected to mention was that bears actually eat bees. So that's, one more pest of bees than she's walking out without looking at me. Okay, so yeah. So I'm not really here to do a very in-depth dive into bee health for you today. What I am hopefully going to talk about is, or what I am planning on talking about at any rate, is guiding you through the technical jargon and industry speak for some of the conditions and woes which are plaguing bees currently. And first and foremost, so that when we see stories in mass media or social media, we can kind of start to distinguish between some of the terms and some of the potential corrective measures, because a lot of these things sound the same but actually have different root causes and different corrective measures. So first and foremost, the message I hope everyone takes home today is that Canada is free from colony collapse disorder. We do not have a single case of colony collapse disorder. I'll get into what exactly colony collapse disorder is in a few minutes, but even the discoverer, the lead CCD investigator in North America, has been unable to find, since 2011, a classically defined case of colony collapse disorder in North America. That being said, neonicotinoid insecticides kill bees. They are insecticides, they are toxic to bees, they do kill bees. Very acutely toxic, and some chronic toxicity effects as well. In spite of that, bees can be protected from them. And I think if we look across Western Canada, the success that Western Canadian in particular, but Canadian bees in general are seeing, is the result of how well producers are stewarding the products they have and protecting bees from the products which can kill them. Oop, I've gone through a lot of slides suddenly. There we go. So, and I guess with that is that there are a lot of honeybees in Canada. Probably not enough bees, but we'll get into that in a moment. So I will ask everyone if this is colony collapse disorder. No, you're right. This I actually lifted without permission from an anti-GMO page. This was being construed as colony collapse disorder, and this is not. This is a bunch of dead bees. It's awful, don't get me wrong, it's disgusting, but that is not colony collapse disorder. Colony collapse disorder describes a very specific set of conditions, and the first one is a rapid loss of adult bees. All of the drones and workers just take off one day, leaving typically healthy capped brood and in many cases the queen behind, which is extremely unusual because bees will abandon a colony or a hive for a number of reasons, but when they do, they tend to wait until their larvae are mature and take them with them, completely abandoning the hive. With a colony collapse disorder case, this is not the case. And there seem to be sufficient food stores, there's good honey, and there's no real difference in parasitism, disease, or pesticide loads in a hive that is suffering from colony collapse disorder compared to a healthy one. So there's a pretty narrowly defined range of what colony collapse disorder is. And this is it. And it's still unexplained right now, by the way. It's probably not any one particular issue. It's probably going to come out as a mesh of different factors all lining up at once. But that being said, there are lots of other reasons why bees die. And the biggest one in Canada is going to be winter kill. We target losses, or the industry at any rate, targets losses of 15 to 20%, which is a little bit hard to pin down because modern beekeeping really didn't start until the mid-1980s. Until then, beekeepers quite frequently, and actually as a regular practice, would gas their bees with cyanide in the fall and then buy new colonies coming up from the States after the almond pollination in California. So as far as overwintering goes, this is really something new. The mid-80s is basically the birth of modern beekeeping in Canada. So with that, the feel is, and the data support, that a overwintering loss of 15 to 20% is sustainable and really to be expected under the kinds of winters we typically see in Canada. The longer winter, more severe and more variable winters tend to have more bee mortalities. For example, Manitoba in the winter of 12-13 experienced about 46% loss of colonies. And Ontario last year lost over half. About 56% of the colonies died over winter. The reason for this could be just the temperature alone, but also the stresses put on the bees through winter from parasites and disease. I'm sure everyone has heard about varroa mites and nosema. These are two very large factors that contribute to or detract from, I guess, bee health going into the winter. And the one that we have the most control over here as agricultural producers is pesticide exposure. We do kill bees with pesticides. The insecticides we use are toxic to insects. Bees are insects. And the one that has garnered the most attention over the last few years is a name that pretty much anyone, lay people, in the non-agriculture community would be able to name, is neonicotinoids, neonics. Lots of action around the world, not a lot of it science-based. So we've got a few pictures here that again we lifted from some activist pages asking us to stop the mass death of bees. One particular company is mentioned here a couple of times, and asking for bans for a product. And I kind of get the feeling that most non-agricultural people don't realize that neonics aren't all insecticides. I feel like there's a misconception that the average person thinks once neonicotinoids are banned, there will be no insecticide spraying, and that's just not the case. They're one of many classes of insecticides, sorry. Now, I'm not a toxicologist. I got these slides from Shelley Hoover. She's with Alberta Agriculture out of Lethbridge. So I'll just breeze through them really quickly. Neonics are a class of neuroactive insecticides chemically similar to nicotine, which, any smokers in the crowd? Ex-smokers? A few ex-smokers, wonderful stuff. I used to love smoking. And they include a few products which we have registered in Canada and some that we actually really don't have. So acetamiprid, I believe is called a sale, but I can't remember because I've never actually used it. Clothianidin is Prosper, imidacloprid is, I believe, Poncho, and thimethoxam is Helix. So these are the products that we tend to use tend to be seed treatment based, with the exception of acetamiprid, which is used in potatoes in Alberta actually, and that is going to be foliar. So on the technical side, neonics bind to receptors in the insect's central nervous system, low levels causing excitedness of the nerves, and higher levels result in paralysis of death. This is constant across pretty much all species of insects that are susceptible to the products. They block a very specific pathway, and there are a few insecticide pathways that we have products that have acted on. But the neonicotinoid receptive pathway is more abundant in insects than mammals. So when these products first came out in the mid-90s, we were actually really excited about them because their relative toxicity is a whole lot less than some of the older chemistries we were using, the organophosphates, which were used in World War II and World War I as nerve gases, against people. So we took a compound that was essentially present in nature and in our glorious, glorious tobacco and modified it to make it more safe for people and less safe for insects. Just one of a few classes of insecticides now that we found in nature, the top one being the synthetic pyrethroids. Those actually come from chrysanthemum, and deltamethrin, sahelothrin, which would be Matador, the Deeses of the world, a few years ago, DDT, all came from the sodium channel of that same pathway. Found in nature, made safer, and released as agricultural products. We look at the third one, and again, nicotine, was identified as an insecticide as early as the 1680s, and through the application of science, we made products that were more selective and less toxic. And how much so? Well, a lot. Particularly for birds and fish. So if we take the raw ingredients of some of these older chemistries, we see some extreme toxicity from the organophosphates and pyrethroids, and even nicotine. Nicotine itself is quite toxic to both bees, birds, and fish. With the advent of the new class, the neonicotinoids, we saw much greater improvements in mammalian toxicity to the point that clothianidin is essentially non-toxic to humans, and decreased, I guess, the toxicity to bees and fish by orders of magnitude. So we were all extremely happy about this. So then what is the problem? Well, 2012 was when these things first really started to rear their heads in Canada, or the problems with them, I should say. And what we saw was a very widespread adoption of vacuum planter technology, particularly in Ontario and corn, which is awesome, really. It's a new method of seeding. It's very precise. It's a fantastic seeding technology. The only problem is, can I bring this? Oh, nobody can see the marker on this one. Okay. The only problem is, we look right here. This is the vent. I can't see on that one anyway. From the vacuum. So in corn, they require a lubricant to be mixed with the corn seed that helps the seed flow into the vacuum modules and prevents hanging up. And the seeds fall down and and get spaced properly. And what should happen is a fantastic corn stand. Here, though, these vents are actually pointed directly up on some of the early models. So that talc that was wrestling around with the insecticide and the seed in the seed bin picked up a lot of the insecticide and blew off into the atmosphere and landed on some of the plants on the side of the field. And 2012 in Ontario was a very early spring. So we had raw product basically landing on the top of flowering plants earlier in the year than ever. And we started seeing mass die-offs of colonies and hives that were located close to farms that had adopted these technologies. We identified it very quickly, and there was a lot. There were a lot of incidents of this in Ontario. Like I said, it was the confluence of a couple different conditions: the widespread adoption of a new technology, earlier spring than usual, and earlier flowering. So to correct this, a very simple mechanical adaptation was devised, and that was a vent director to direct this dust coming off of the seed boxes to the ground, where it wouldn't land on flowering plants on the edge of the field and be sent directly to the ground. So on the picture here, we can see a couple of quick schematics on how to build one for yourself. And the picture on the right is that same drill from slide 1 with a tube venting the seed down between, or venting the airflow, sorry, down between the rows, preventing the exposure of the insects to the insecticide. As well, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency came up with some best management practices for using these products. And that included using airflow diverters to direct the flow of the talc to the ground, but also the elimination of talc as a seed box lubricant. That and graphite both were able to pick up significant amounts of the insecticide and deposit them on the soil surface and into the atmosphere. A new one by Bayer Crop Science is now required to be used in corn. Graphite and talc are now essentially gone. So the result of that now is a 70% reduction in post-planting bee losses in 2014. So 70% less than the year prior, which was less than the year before that. In 2014, three-quarters of those reported kills in Ontario came from 3 beekeepers. So what we've got is a very localized regional issue with a product that under a new use pattern that we hadn't anticipated started causing some problems. And then we identified that problem as an agronomic one that we could manage and mitigate, and then we in fact did. We see the drawing here where risk is a function of hazard times exposure. If you've got a hazard but you're not exposed to it, it's not really risky. Take, for example, electricity. We kill people with it, but our lives are made extremely easy by it. As long as you're not touching it, it is very safe for you. So to put it into a perspective that the previous speaker would be able to speak to, proximity. The exposure on the left is a slightly less toxic product, but in very close proximity. This is a very risky situation. We look across to the fence on the right-hand side. We have a very toxic product that is isolated from me by a truck window, a fence, and a lot of grass. Now, if I were to go walking across that field with a pile or pail of fish guts, that situation would become untenable rapidly. And that's essentially what the situation in Ontario was. The confluence of some bad conditions. Now, specifically to Alberta, we tend not to see the same kind of kills that they saw in the spring of 2012 and 13 in Ontario that in Alberta. So we do have a few products. These are the 4 that are registered in Alberta and used on a wide basis. Acetamiprid is foliar in alfalfa, corn, and potato crops I don't really deal with that much, so I don't really know a lot about that particular product. Except for the fact that it is actually immune to the moratorium on neonicotinoid insecticides in Europe. It's a foliar neonic that is actually still registered for use after the moratorium. So we'll touch on that a little more in a second. But the 3 that we've got here are clothianidin, which is present in prosper on canola, thiamethoxam, which is present as Helix Extra and Cruiser Max in wheat, and imidacloprid, which is present in Raxil WW. When we look at how much of the product is actually making it through the canola plants into the nectar and pollen, which is what the food sources are for bees, in canola in particular, the vast majority of the samples that we collected and analyzed had no neonic residue in them whatsoever. We could not detect it. 16% had one neonic present, 14% had two, and 1.5% had three identifiable neonics. Most likely imidacloprid, thiamethoxam, and clothianidin, and I would anticipate that was because canola was grown on wheat stubble that had been treated with a wireworm product. So I assume that's where that came from. But because that is actually one thing that we do know is that these will, even though they're water soluble with our clay-based soils, we don't see a lot of infiltration. And we will actually find these products in the soil the year after. It is theoretically possible for the plants to take them up and have them present in pollen and nectar, but at extremely low levels and to the point at which most of the samples that we investigate don't have a significant amount in them at all. Now, the fact that we can find them is miraculous in and of itself because we're talking about parts per billion. When we do find some neonicotinoid in our canola pollen, it's at around an average of 1 part per billion. Now, this is a full order of magnitude below even the most conservative estimates for acute toxicity and on the extreme low edge of what is considered for long-term chronic exposure. So some of the numbers that are thrown around are based on a cumulative amount of insecticide eaten, and that's basically what the LD50 is. The concentration is one thing, and even at these concentrations, they're pretty much below even the most aggressive estimates for damage. But when we investigate this in the field, however, we don't see evidence of mortality or altered behavior. So you may recall that from my earlier slide that the presence of a neonicotinoid causes some erratic behavior. When we analyze it at field scales, we don't actually, in canola, we don't actually see any increased mortality or altered behavior in bees during planting or through the plant at nectar time. This was some work that was done in 2007 initially, and when it was published, there were a few flaws identified in it, mostly with the distance that bees were able to forage, and a couple other technical statistical analysis ones as well. So the product was rerun in 2013 and published again in 2014 with essentially the exact same numbers. The rates that we're using them are just not a concern for honeybees. So in general, how are the bees doing? Anyone who's read a newspaper in the last couple of years would probably guess that they're on the verge of going extinct. Agreement, disagreement, yeah? And that's certainly been popularized in media. Unfortunately, it's not true. Well, perhaps fortunately, it's not true. Globally, we have more honeybees than we ever have. So these are UN FAO numbers. We have more bees in the world than we ever have had. Bees are managed livestock, essentially. They're not native to Canada or North America, and the majority of the plants that evolved in North America evolved without honeybee presence. That being said, it is a very global, widespread industry that is actually doing fairly well. Now, if we look specifically to Canada, we actually see more colonies than we've ever seen, approaching 700,000 managed honeybee colonies in Canada. That's a fair bit. If we look at the red curve, that is the number of beekeepers. So just like every other facet of agriculture, we're seeing consolidation. Less and less operators doing more and more. Probably driven by economics, but we do see here in the last 5 or 6 years or so a little bit of an uptick in the number of beekeepers, and that could be as a result of the widespread increase in urban beekeeping, which is an interesting little subset to the industry. But I think this slide really, for me, drives home that apiculture is part of agriculture, and we are all agriculture together. They're facing the same economic challenges that the rest of agriculture is. Declining margins requiring more and more management, more inputs, and a larger base. Now, that's not to say that there aren't declines in pollinators, because there, in fact, are. In the US, they've been in pretty much constant decline since World War II. So they have the least amount, or approaching the least amount of bees that they've had since the 40s. Interestingly, colony collapse disorder was identified as a widespread problem in 2006, and since then we've actually seen their numbers stabilize somewhat. The American beekeeping model is substantially different than the Canadian one, however. There are just under 3 million hives or colonies, in the US. A little over 2/3 of them are in California in February and March for the almond pollination. And that actually used to be the source of Canadian bee colonies. Canadian beekeepers would kill their bees in the fall and then buy big, full, healthy hives coming off of the almond pollination in California. That doesn't happen anymore, so these colonies are all getting shipped back into the Midwest. And the Midwest cropping regime is corn, soy, and grassland. These are not crops that hold a significant amount of nutrition for bees. So there are efforts in the US to start planting some of the conservation reserve acres into flowering habitat for bees, because one of the challenges you may recall to overwintering health is in nutrition. And if bees have to go from the beginning of March until essentially the end of September or the beginning of October in parts of the US without a broad-based or plentiful food substrate, they're not going to go into the winter in full and proper health. So now we take a look at the European example, because that's one that we're getting pressured to adopt in the Western Hemisphere with regards to some of these seed treatments. And we do see a decline in France as well. France is interesting. They have a little bit of a different beekeeping dynamic there as well. Their average size is under 300 hives per beekeeper. Here we go. Sorry. In 1989, after some interesting studies that were done showing that some of these seed treatments can persist through the plant into the pollen and into the nectar, France started restricting one in particular, and that was imidacloprid. Didn't really have any effect on the long-term populations of their bees. So with some new information and some of these similar dust kills that were happening in Ontario started happening in Europe as well, they placed restrictions, they made these restrictions even wider. So in 2004, imidacloprid was banned outright in maize and sunflower. Clothanidin was never actually registered in France, but again, we see this same decline moving forward as we move from left to right. Their industry is in decline for a number of reasons, and they seem to be largely economic, because when we look at the rest of Europe, their numbers are on the increase and have been for quite some time. So the beekeeping industry in the bulk of in the bulk of Europe, is actually doing quite well. A little over just under 12 million colonies in total in Europe, all of which are doing quite well. Again, the kind of losses that we see from these seed treatments tend to be acute kills, which are very, very manageable through isolating bees or the product from each other so that they aren't exposed to each other. So again, like I said, I didn't get into or want to get into the ups and downs or ins and outs of the general state of affairs of the nutrition of the bees. I just really wanted to show the difference between some of the terms that are being used and conflated, because winter kill is not colony collapse disorder, and neither of those two things are a decline of bees in Canada or globally for that matter. And the declines that we do seem to be happening, seem to be a little bit more economic related than health factor. So Canada is free from colony collapse disorder, and we do know that these products are toxic to bees. This is well established in literature. We've got a lot of studies that demonstrate this, and some of them have started to conflate, again, chronic, or not even chronic, but acute toxicity with colony collapse disorder, and that would be the most famous one from last year, which was publicized as a Harvard study, which was basically feeding bees in excess of the LD50s for them, and after the defined amount of time in the experiment ran out with no effect on the bees, he increased the dose and added more time to the study. And when he started killing his bees, published it, didn't really publish it, went straight to a press release and announced that he had definitively linked neonicotinoids to colony collapse disorder, when all he had really done was redo some of the toxicity work that was already well established in literature. No one actually read the study, unfortunately. So that being said, bees can be protected from insecticides, and on the prairies in particular, we do a really good job of that. We have a great partnership and a great relationship with the beekeeping industry and the beekeepers, particularly on the prairies and in eastern Canada as well. And to that end, the Canola Council and the Honey Council together released a series of videos that you can see on both of our websites. We're hosting them, and the Honey Council links to them, with beekeepers and canola growers in field together, talking about what they do to benefit each other and the kinds of things they can do for each other. It's actually really, really good. There are lots of honeybees, but there probably aren't enough bees. So some of the studies that I was talking about yield increases in canola, were done under stocking rates that are well in excess of what we have, so at around a hive or to a hive and a half per acre. With 20 million acres of canola in Western Canada and about 500,000 hives that are available to pollinate it, we have about 40 times less bees than we could use to see the maximum amount of yield effect from bee colonies. So I guess from a canola perspective, we love bees and their habitat. So the reason we don't see such massive declines in canola yield that we would expect if canola was only pollinated by bees was the fact that there is a few dozen different species of native pollinators out there as well that take advantage of our hedgerows and stubble and uncultivated areas as well. So there is some really interesting work that's starting to quantify the relationship between cultivated canola and uncultivated acres nearby. In many cases, it would appear that just having those uncultivated acres, which can be difficult to seed around, do provide enough of a repository for native species to complete their life cycle and make up that yield gap that we seem to be missing or would theoretically be missing from not having enough bees. And I've taken that one step further. I provide habitat for native pollinators in my beard. So I do encourage everyone to go to our website, have a look at these videos. There's one long one that's about 20 minutes long that summarizes the entire position and the entire relationship between beekeepers and canola growers, as well as 4 shorter ones, and one particularly is designed with the best management practices for our insecticides in mind. So it goes into a little bit more detail the things that growers can do in the meantime. So I can be reached, I'm Gregory Sekulic. I can be reached at email, sekulic@canola.org. I am SekulicCCC on Twitter, and I rest assured I am sitting at home waiting for your call. And I do have a couple minutes for questions, which is unusual for me, so yes.
Can I go to the mic? You can repeat out.
Yeah, I'll try and repeat the question.
Okay, so a lot of what you're telling us we've heard with other wildlife, that it's actually not the toxin necessarily, but it's maybe the habitat.
Yes.
So is the Canola Council, I challenge the Canola Council of Canada to implement a policy where they maintain native bee habitat as part of their expanding their acreage to whatever they want by 2025. Would you like to respond to that challenge?
Did everyone hear the question? Okay, basically it is a challenge to the canola industry to maintain that habitat for a lot of the native species that are filling the pollination gap left behind by the fact that we probably don't have enough bees on canola during its 6-week flowering period. Is that challenge accepted? Because that's actually a very large part of what I'm writing into my own particular job. My area of specialization at Council is sustainable production. And with that, habitat conservation is going to be moving forward, a very significant pillar of that. So I in particular, I'm really excited, and the Canola Council, by extension, is really excited about the opportunity to work with the nature conservancies and the Ducks Unlimiteds of the world to maintain, preserve, and improve a lot of this habitat that is being eaten up through farm consolidation and wetland draining. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer.
If we had more bees in a canola field, would that increase the yields?
Question was if we had more bees in the canola field, would that increase the yield? The studies that we have done would indicate yes. And because we can document in literature yield increases from like 25 to 40% with the presence of bees. Some of the methodologies aren't that great. They seem to be a caged plant with bees and a caged plant without insects. So I think a lot of these studies overstate some of that relationship. But that being said, hives are typically placed in a yard and in some cases miles away from a canola field at stocking rates that are well below what we would see in these studies, which are at like 1 to 1.5 hives per acre. 3 per hectare is what the highest yielding studies are. So if we could increase that, we should plausibly expect to see a yield bump. And we've been estimating that at between like 5 and 15% or so from increasing the stock density of bees on a field, and we would certainly like to see that.
So how many bees per square foot?
How many bees per square foot? I don't know. But a hive per acre spaced out fairly regularly because they really won't go further than about 150 or 200 meters from the hive into a canola field, because why would they? There's billions of flowers between them and that 200 meter radius. So we need to spread them out a little. We need to do a little bit better job of spreading them out, I guess, is the take-home message there. One more question, I guess, yes.
I had a question just for clarification. Numbers talk about bees, and then there's native pollinators.
Yes.
In the media, there's crossing up, and then there's what industry talks about. Can you elaborate just a little bit the difference in bee numbers that you showed us, and native pollinators, if you have any kind of statistics, and what impact might be on the native pollinators?
Yes, so just going to highlight really quickly the difference between managed pollinators and native pollinators, and then what our impacts are on them respectively. Did I understand that correctly? Okay, managed bees are literally livestock, and they're actually doing quite well globally. So there are good, healthy reserves of bees to pull from. Queen breeding happening in Australia and New Zealand, where they don't have varroa mite, things like this. Not in decline. There are regions which are in decline, probably for some specific reasons and for some of the practices involved, like the migratory beekeeping in the US probably isn't the best for bee health to be trucking bees on the back of a truck for 2,000 miles to almonds and then back again into a habitat or into a landscape that doesn't have a particularly diverse habitat to it. Native pollinators, however, are in decline, and that's in both abundance and diversity. Some of that could be the result of where we're doing the surveys, because we tend to be surveying the agro-ecosystem, which is increasingly losing a lot of its uncultivated areas. Fence lines getting taken out for field consolidation or wetlands being drained. And when we say wetlands, I think there might be a misconception amongst the ag community that we mean that swamp on the other side of the hill over there that is underwater all year. And a lot of this work is actually being done on just prairie potholes, low spots within fields. These are, like, I'm aware that they're difficult to seed around the 70-foot equipment, but they are very important and very valuable repositories of habitat for a lot of native species. So we are impacting the habitats of our native species largely through our activities, yeah. And obviously insects being susceptible to insecticides would be feeling the brunt of those applications in field as well, yeah.